You're crouched near a fire, some 70,000 years ago, and the sun has just gone down over the African savanna. You're not thinking about much. You're tired. You've been walking since before dawn. The fire is warm, and the smoke drifts in whatever direction the wind decides, which tonight is directly into your face. You breathe it in. You cough. You shift around. And then, at some point, something changes. The smoke is different tonight, not the wood. Something that caught in the branches at the edge of the fire. Something with a smell you don't have a word for, because words are a fairly recent invention. But the feeling is new, and it is not bad. This is not a story about cigarettes. It is not a story about the tobacco industry, or addiction, or the Surgeon General's warning, or that one relative at every family gathering who steps outside every 40 minutes and comes back smelling like a slightly different atmosphere. This is the story that comes long before any of that. The story of the first time a human being, in any deliberate or semi-deliberate way, chose to inhale something burning, and the evidence for when that happened, and why, and what it meant, is genuinely one of the stranger and more illuminating corners of the entire human archaeological record. Because here is the thing that almost nobody leads with when this topic comes up. Smoking does not begin with tobacco. It does not begin with pipes, or rituals, or any specific plant at all. It begins with fire, and fire is so old and so constant in the human story that the line between accidentally inhaling smoke and deliberately seeking it out may be one of the blurriest lines in all of prehistory. Blurry, but not invisible. And the evidence of where it falls is, depending on your tolerance for the strange, either fascinating or completely unnerving, possibly both. Before you can smoke anything, you need fire, and fire has been part of the human story for so long that it predates our species entirely. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire used by human ancestors dates to approximately 1 million years ago at a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Archaeologists found burnt bone and plant ash inside the cave in concentrations that rule out a natural wildfire. This was a sustained, contained fire, used deliberately by Homo erectus, the predecessor species that walked the earth long before anyone with our face or our brain capacity showed up. 1 million years ago, and every day of those million years, every ancestor who sat near that fire breathed smoke. There was no choice. You sat at the fire, or you sat in the dark and the cold, and the fire produced smoke, and the smoke went where the wind sent it, which was frequently into the lungs of whoever was sitting closest. Smoke inhalation was not a habit our ancestors developed. It was the original ambient condition of human life, the air quality situation, before anyone had invented the concept of air quality. But here is where the story pivots, because not all smoke is the same. When you burn organic matter, the compounds you release depend entirely on what you are burning. Wood smoke is one thing, but the planet is covered in plants, and many of those plants contain compounds that do something very specific when they are heated and inhaled. Alkaloids, terpenes, cannabinoids, psychoactive molecules that interact with human neurochemistry in ways that are immediately and unmistakably noticeable. And these plants do not confine themselves to particular corners of the map. They grow across Africa, across Asia, across Europe. They have always grown near the places where early humans built fires, which means that at some point, possibly many times over many thousands of years in many different locations, an ancestor of yours sat downwind of the wrong burning plant and had an experience they had never had before. Not unpleasant, distinctly not unpleasant. And one of the more reliable things we know about human cognition, even very ancient human cognition, is that when something produces a noticeable and positive effect, the animal responsible for the experience tries to have it again. This is not sophistication. This is not intelligence in any elevated sense. This is pattern recognition of the most basic kind. That felt different. Let me find the thing that made it feel different. The entire human relationship with psychoactive plants may begin right there, not with a decision, not with a ceremony, with an accident. A very good accident, repeated enough times to become a habit, and eventually a tradition, and eventually a technology. Now here is the part that the standard telling of this story almost always skips, because it requires going one layer deeper into biology than most people expect a history video to go, and it is worth going there because it changes the whole picture. The human brain contains something called the endocannabinoid system. It is a network of receptors distributed throughout the central nervous system that regulates mood, memory, appetite, pain response, and a range of other functions that are fundamental to how you experience being alive from moment to moment. This system did not evolve because of cannabis. It evolved because the body produces its own cannabinoid-like molecules, endocannabinoids, that act on these receptors as part of normal neurological regulation. Cannabis, and the psychoactive compounds it contains, work because they happen to fit the same receptors. The plant did not shape the receptor was already there. And when an early human inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant for the first time, the brain did not register an invasion of foreign chemistry. It registered something that slotted, almost perfectly, into a system that had been waiting for exactly this kind of input. The same logic applies to other psychoactive plants. Opioid receptors in the human brain exist because the body produces endorphins, which are the body's own version of opioid molecules. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors exist because acetylcholine is a fundamental neurotransmitter in the nervous system, and nicotine happens to bind to the same receptor. In every case, the plant did not create the vulnerability. The biology was already there. The plants simply found the door that evolution had built for other reasons and walked through it. This is not a coincidence that the plants and the receptors fit, or rather, it is a coincidence in the sense that it was not designed, but it is not surprising once you understand that evolutionary pressure works on everything simultaneously. Plants that produced compounds capable of attracting animal attention had a dispersal advantage. Animals that responded to those compounds had varying survival outcomes depending on the context. Over millions of years of coevolution, these relationships became embedded in the biology of both the plant and the animal. The human drive towards psychoactive substances is not a weakness or a flaw or a cultural aberration. It is, at least in part, the predictable product of a very old biological relationship between a primate and its chemical environment. Understanding that does not make addiction less real or less harmful, but it does make the question of when humans first smoked something considerably more complex than it initially appears. Let us talk about what the physical evidence actually tells us, because there is a significant difference between what is archaeologically documented and what almost certainly happened before the archaeological record begins. The oldest direct evidence of deliberate psychoactive plant use involving inhalation comes from a burial site in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, dating to approximately 500 BC. Excavators found a set of wooden braziers containing superheated stones alongside cannabis residue with unusually high concentrations of THC. This was not wild-growing hemp collected for fiber or food. The cannabinoid profile of the residue indicates plants that had been specifically selected or cultivated for their psychoactive potency, and the ritual burial context makes the purpose unambiguous. These were not accidental seeds blown into a fire. They were placed there deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it long enough to have developed a specific ceremonial protocol around it. 500 BC, 2,500 years ago. That is the number most people encounter when this topic comes up, and it sounds old. It is not the beginning. In 2019, researchers announced a discovery at a site in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah that pushed the timeline of tobacco use in the Americas back considerably. They found a hearth approximately 12,000 years old, containing the charred seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species native to North America. The concentration and placement of the seeds within the hearth ruled out accidental deposition. These were placed in the fire deliberately 12,000 years ago by people who were hunter-gatherers with no pottery, no agriculture, and no written language of any kind. But they apparently had a relationship with tobacco already established enough to bring it deliberately to a fire and put it in. And here is the problem that every archaeologist working in this field eventually arrives at. Organic material almost never survives. Stone tools from 3 million years ago exist because stone is essentially indestructible under the right conditions. But a leather pouch of dried plant matter, a wooden pipe, a bundle of herbs wrapped in bark, These are gone within a few centuries under normal burial conditions. The physical evidence we have is not a ceiling, it is a floor. The question is not how old the evidence is. The question is how much older the behavior is than the evidence we can currently find. There is a moment in ancient history that deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it sits at the intersection of recorded history and archaeology in a way that is almost too convenient to be true. Except it is completely true, and the fact that it took centuries to verify it says something instructive about how seriously ancient accounts of intoxication were taken by the scholars who came after. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described a practice he had observed or been told about among the Scythians, a nomadic people of the Eurasian steppe. They would, according to his account, construct small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glowed red, and throw hemp seeds onto those heated stones. They would then sit inside the tent in the smoke that resulted. Herodotus wrote that they howled with pleasure. That is the exact phrase in the translation. They howled with pleasure. For the better part of 2,000 years, historians treated this account with skepticism. The assumption was that Herodotus had misunderstood what he saw, or exaggerated it for a Greek audience that would find the behavior of steppe nomads suitably exotic. He was a writer with a reputation for credulity, and the howling with pleasure detail seemed precisely the kind of embellishment a credulous writer might add. Then archaeologists started excavating Scythian burial mounds in earnest, and they found exactly what Herodotus described: bronze braziers, heated stones, hemp residue. The apparatus for exactly the practice he had written about was sitting in the ground, preserved, across dozens of burial sites, precisely as described. Herodotus was not embellishing, he was not misunderstanding. He was doing exactly what a good historian does, which is accurately recording what he had been told or witnessed, and producing a document that turned out to be better evidence than the people who dismissed it gave him credit for. The lesson here is not merely about Scythians or hemp. It is about what the historical record systematically fails to take seriously. Accounts of intoxication, of altered states, of the deliberate use of substances to change consciousness have been consistently treated by later scholars as the least credible parts of ancient testimony. The infrastructure of the Scythian vapor bath was real. The pleasure was real. The practice was real. The dismissal of it was the thing that was wrong. Before any of this became ritual, and long before it became recreational, there is a strong case to be made that intentional smoke inhalation entered human practice through the most practical possible door: medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents that exists anywhere on Earth, dates to ancient Egypt around 1550 BC. It describes, in considerable clinical detail, treatments involving the inhalation of smoke from heated herbs, specifically for conditions affecting the throat and lungs. This is the kind of thing that sounds, from a modern perspective, like exactly the wrong idea. You treat a lung condition by adding smoke to the lungs. But the logic, by the medical standards of the time, is not incoherent. The lungs are the target organ. Smoke reaches the lungs directly. If the herb contains pharmacologically active compounds, delivering those compounds via inhalation is, mechanistically, a completely sound approach. We still do this. Asthma inhalers, nebulized medication, anesthetic gases administered via mask. All of these are the same logic refined by 2,000 years of chemistry, but operating on the same fundamental principle: the lungs absorb what you breathe. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine describes a practice called dhumapana, which translates literally as smoke drinking. It appears in texts dating back over 3,000 years and involves the deliberate inhalation of specific herb combinations through pipes, prescribed for specific conditions with specific dosing protocols and contraindications. This was not folk practice in the dismissive sense. It was a documented, systematized therapeutic approach with a body of accumulated clinical knowledge behind it, refined over centuries of practice. The ancient Greeks used therapeutic smoke regularly. Hippocrates, the figure who gave his name to the oath that medical professionals still invoke today, wrote about the inhalation of herbal vapors as treatment for pulmonary and respiratory conditions. Ancient Chinese medicine incorporated inhalation therapy into frameworks that explicitly mapped the practice to specific organ systems and diagnostic categories. In every major ancient civilization we have detailed medical records from, deliberate smoke inhalation appears not as an aberration or an indulgence, but as a recognized therapeutic tool used by physicians who considered themselves to be applying rational method to biological problems. Whether they were right, by modern standards, varies enormously depending on what was being burned. But the point is not whether ancient medicine was correct. The point is that the deliberate use of smoke as a delivery mechanism for biologically active plant compounds is old enough and widespread enough and technically sophisticated enough that it cannot be explained as superstition or accident. These were people solving a practical problem with the tools available to them. And the tool they landed on was fire. There is a theory that circulates in anthropology and psychopharmacology that has never quite entered mainstream understanding, possibly because it is uncomfortable, possibly because it is too simple, possibly because it makes a claim about human nature that most people would rather not sit with. Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, proposed in the 1980s that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth biological drive, alongside hunger, thirst, and the drive to reproduce, that is embedded in the behavior of animals generally and humans specifically. Not a cultural phenomenon, not a social failure, a drive. The same category of motivational force as the things we consider the most basic and the most non-negotiable of animal imperatives. The evidence he marshaled was broad and genuinely difficult to dismiss. Elephants deliberately seek out fermented marula fruit, not when they happen across it, but as a specific behavioral goal, traveling to where they know it will be available and consuming it in quantities that produce visible behavioral change. Reindeer in Siberia seek out and consume Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the red and white capped fungus that contains psychoactive ibotenic acid, and other reindeer in the same herd have been observed consuming the urine of the individuals who ate the mushrooms because the psychoactive compounds pass through the body largely intact. Reindeer performing what is, functionally, psychoactive substance recycling. Cats respond to nipetolactone in catnip with a behavioral sequence that has no food-seeking or reproductive function whatsoever. Birds in various species have been documented eating fermented berries and subsequently behaving in ways that look, from the outside, conspicuously like intoxication. The drive to alter consciousness, if Siegel's framework is correct, is not a human invention and not a human weakness. It is a feature of animal cognition that appears wherever sufficiently complex nervous systems and sufficiently available psychoactive substances encounter each other under the right conditions. And humans, for reasons having to do with the scale of our brains and the sophistication of our pattern recognition, took that drive further than any other species, identified the specific plants and compounds involved, learned to cultivate them, learned to concentrate them, learned to deliver them more effectively, and eventually built entire civilizations organized partly around controlling who had access to them. That last step, the civilizational one, is where things go wrong in the ways we are familiar with. But the drive itself is older than civilization. It may be older than our species. The uncomfortable part of this story is not the ancient part. The ancient part is genuinely fascinating, a species exploring its neurochemical landscape through fire and plant and accumulated generational knowledge, developing ritual and medicine and ceremony and social technology around a set of experiences that were real, if not always understood. The uncomfortable part is what happened when a small group of people figured out how to commodify it. Tobacco arrived in Europe from the Americas in the late 15th century. The specific moment of contact is documented. Columbus, in 1492, writing in his journal about indigenous people walking with small burning rolls of dried leaves, inhaling the smoke, and exhaling it, in a manner his crew found utterly baffling. His crew also, within weeks, tried it themselves. Of course they did. In the Americas, tobacco had been used for thousands of years before this contact in a framework that was almost entirely ceremonial and medicinal. Not recreational, sacred. The shaman who smoked was not smoking casually. The smoke was understood as a carrier, a substance that moved between the physical and the spiritual in a direction useful to the community. Blowing smoke on someone was a gesture of blessing. The plant was treated with a reverence appropriate to something powerful, which it is. The fact that it was also addictive was managed by the ritual framework around it. When something is sacred, you do not use it carelessly. When something carries spiritual weight, you use it with the discipline appropriate to that weight. What European industrialization did to tobacco was remove every layer of that framework and replace it with a profit motive. Within 4 centuries, a practice that indigenous cultures had maintained as a controlled, ceremonial, deeply intentional engagement with a powerful plant was turned into a mass-market consumer product, then into an industrial product, then into a product that required billions of dollars of scientific effort to make more addictive, and then into a product whose manufacturers spent decades suppressing internal evidence that it was killing the people who bought it. The same plant, a completely different relationship to it. The shaman and the cigarette executive both worked with tobacco. The distance between them is not measured in years. It is measured in the complete inversion of every ethical orientation that surrounded the original practice. So, when did ancient humans first discover smoking? The physical evidence takes us to 12,000 years ago with confidence, to 500 BC with extraordinary archaeological detail, and through Herodotus and the Ebers Papyrus and the Ayurvedic texts to a picture of deliberate smoke inhalation as a universal and ancient human practice across every major civilization we have records of. The behavioral drive underneath it, the pull toward altered states, toward the specific neurochemical experiences that certain burning plants produce, is almost certainly older than all of this. It may be as old as fire itself. It may, if the intoxication hypothesis has merit, be older than fire, latent in the biology of the primate brain, waiting for the moment a plant and a flame and a curious, pattern-recognizing mind arrived in the same place at the same time. What we do know is this. By the time anyone thought to write any of this down, it was already ancient. By the time Herodotus described Scythians howling with pleasure in their smoke-filled tents, that practice already had a history long enough to have produced specific equipment, specific ceremonies, specific social norms around it. By the time the Ebers Papyrus prescribed herbal inhalation for lung conditions, the therapeutic framework it described had already been refined through generations of practical use. The written record is not the beginning of this story. It is the moment the story became old enough that someone thought it worth preserving. There is something in that worth sitting with. The oldest habits of our species are the ones we have the least documentation for, precisely because they were so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of daily and ritual life, that nobody thought to explain them. You do not write down instructions for breathing. You do not write down instructions for eating. And for most of human history, you did not write down instructions for gathering around a fire with your people and inhaling what the burning plants offered. You just did it, because you had always done it. Because your parents had done it and their parents before them, all the way back through the smoke and the dark to some ancestor crouched near a fire in Africa who breathed in at the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right moment, and felt something shift. That shift has never really stopped. The next time you smell wood smoke on a cold night, or watch a fire, or catch a whiff of something burning that smells like it might be more than wood, you are picking up a signal that your nervous system has been calibrated to receive for longer than modern humans have existed. What you do with that information is entirely up to you, but it is worth knowing where the signal comes from. Let me know your thoughts below, and if this is the kind of deep history you want more of, you know what to do.